The grand ballroom shimmered with opulence. Golden chandeliers, casting a warm glow over the sea of elite guests, draped in designer suits and glittering gowns. Laughter and the clinking of champagne glasses filled the air, a celebration of wealth, power, and status. Among them stood billionaire Victor Langston, tall, impeccably dressed, and radiating an air of untouchable arrogance. With his sharp jawline and piercing eyes, he commanded attention effortlessly, basking in the admiration of those eager to be in his good graces. But amidst the luxury and privilege, a young maid moved discreetly through the crowd, her posture stiff, her expression carefully neutral. Her name was Aisha, a striking woman with deep brown skin and quiet dignity. Though her uniform and lowly position rendered her invisible in this world of excess, she wasn't supposed to be here, not in a place like this. Yet life had a cruel way of placing people exactly where they didn't want to be. As she reached for a half-empty glass on the table near Victor, her hand trembled slightly. The weight of exhaustion from working double shifts bore down on her, but she pushed through. It was just another night, another event, another group of people who saw her as nothing more than a shadow in the background. Then it happened. A slight miscalculation, a tilt of the glass at the wrong angle, and in an instant, champagne spilled onto the crisp sleeve of Victor Langston's custom-tailored jacket. The room fell silent. The moment stretched unbearably, suffocating under the weight of expectation. Every eye in the room turned to them, waiting, anticipating. A billionaire humiliated, a maid at fault. It was a scene that promised entertainment for the privileged. Victor's face darkened, his nostrils flaring. "Are you blind?" His voice, sliced through the quiet, thick with disgust. "Do you have any idea how much this jacket costs? Probably more than you'll ever make in your miserable life." Aisha swallowed hard, her heart pounding. The humiliation burned through her, but she refused to let her face betray the storm inside. She had been insulted before. She had endured worse. But something about his voice, the sheer venom in it, made her stomach twist. "I'm so sorry, sir," she said, lowering her gaze. "Sorry?" Victor scoffed, his voice rising. "Of course you're sorry. That's all people like you ever are. Sorry and incompetent." The murmurs in the room grew louder, some guests exchanging knowing smirks, while others averted their eyes, unwilling to get involved. Aisha clenched her fists, forcing herself to remain still. She needed this job. She couldn't afford to lose it over pride, no matter how much she wanted to throw that same glass of champagne in his face. Victor waved his hand dismissively. "Get out of my sight before you ruin something else." Aisha turned on her heel, her jaw locked so tightly it hurt. She willed herself not to cry, not to let the humiliation seep into her bones. But just as she stepped away, she heard something that made her freeze. One of the guests, an older woman with silver-streaked hair, leaned toward Victor and said in a hushed tone, "She looks familiar. Are you sure you don't know her?" Victor barely glanced at Aisha before scoffing. "Why on earth would I know some lowly maid?" The words stung more than they should have. Aisha kept walking, disappearing into the back corridors of the mansion, her heart a war zone of emotions. If only he knew, if only he remembered. Because the man who had just humiliated her in front of a room full of people, the billionaire who saw her as nothing more than dirt beneath his feet, was the father who had abandoned her before she was even old enough to remember his face. But Victor Langston didn't recognize her. Not yet. Aisha stormed through the back corridors of the mansion, her breaths coming out in sharp, uneven gasps. The humiliation still clung to her like a second skin, but underneath it was something far more powerful: rage. Not just at Victor Langston's cruel words, but at the bitter irony of it all. He had discarded her before she ever had the chance to know him. And now, years later, he had insulted her without even realizing who she was. She pressed her back against the cold marble wall, squeezing her eyes shut. She had grown up with questions, ones her mother never wanted to answer. All she had ever been told was that her father had left, that he had chosen wealth and power over responsibility. Aisha had long stopped wondering about him, accepting that he was nothing more than a ghost in her past. But fate had pulled them into the same room, forcing her to face a man who didn't even know she existed. A voice broke through her thoughts. "Aisha, are you okay?" She opened her eyes to see Michael, one of the senior waiters, watching her with concern. He had always looked out for her, knowing how hard she worked to support herself. "I'm fine," she muttered, though her voice betrayed her. Michael sighed, glancing toward the ballroom. "I saw what happened. He's a real piece of work, that one." Aisha let out a dry, humorless laugh. "You have no idea." Michael frowned at the weight behind her words, but didn't press. Instead, he handed her a fresh cloth. "Go to the staff lounge. Take a break. I'll cover for you." She hesitated before nodding. She needed a moment to collect herself, to process the mess of emotions swirling inside her. As she walked toward the staff lounge, memories of her childhood resurfaced. Growing up, she had learned to live without a father, but she had never truly escaped the consequences of his absence. She had watched her mother struggle to keep a roof over their heads, working endless hours just to make ends meet. She had learned early on that life was unfair, that some people were born into privilege, while others had to fight for every scrap. And now, standing in the shadows of the mansion, owned by the very man who had abandoned her, she realized something. Victor Langston didn't just forget about her. He had erased her. The thought made her stomach turn. Meanwhile, back in the ballroom, Victor had already moved on, laughing with his high-profile guests as if nothing had happened. But something lingered in his mind, a nagging feeling he couldn't quite place. The girl? There was something about her, the shape of her eyes, the way she held herself. For a split second, she had looked at him with something more than just shame or fear. There had been anger, pain. He shook off the thought. Why would he waste time thinking about some nameless maid? He had more important matters to focus on, like finalizing his latest business deal, one that would cement his status as one of the most powerful men in the city. But as the night wore on, the feeling didn't fade. A few days later, Aisha found herself assigned to work an exclusive charity gala, another event hosted by Victor Langston. She had debated calling in sick, but something in her refused to back down. She had spent her whole life running from the truth, from her past. But not anymore. As she moved through the hall, balancing a tray of drinks, she caught sight of Victor, standing near a group of investors. His presence alone filled the room, his confidence unshakable. But this time, she wasn't intimidated. She was done being invisible. She made her way toward the table where Victor stood, her hands steady, despite the storm inside her. As she placed a glass near him, their eyes met, and this time, she saw something flicker in his expression. A moment of recognition, confusion, and then the unthinkable happened. One of the older guests, an acquaintance of Victor's, leaned in with a smirk. "Victor, you should be careful how you treat the help. This one looks just like someone I knew a long time ago." Victor's brow furrowed. "What are you talking about?" The man chuckled, glancing at Aisha before turning back to Victor. "She reminds me of... what was her name? That woman you were involved with years ago. The one who disappeared. The Air in the room grew thick with tension. Victor's expression darkened. His mind raced, piecing together fragments of a past he had long buried. And suddenly, it hit him. The shape of her eyes, the way she carried herself, the familiar fire in her gaze. His blood ran cold. Aisha met his stare, her own filled with quiet defiance. She knew, and now, so did he. Victor's heart pounded in his chest as he stared at Aisha, the realization hitting him like a tidal wave. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. No, it couldn't be. But the longer he looked at her, the harder it became to deny the truth. The resemblance was undeniable. The shape of her eyes, the sharpness of her features, the same fire in her gaze that he once saw in her mother. Aisha held his stare, refusing to look away. She saw the flicker of shock in his eyes, the way his confident posture stiffened, as if the weight of the past had finally caught up to him. Victor cleared his throat, forcing composure back into his voice. "Who are you?" His tone was low, but it carried an edge of uncertainty. Aisha's lips curled into a tight, bitter smile. "You don't recognize me, do you?" Her voice was calm, but beneath it was a storm of emotions. "I'm not surprised. After all, you never looked back." The room around them faded. The conversations, the clinking glasses, the music. It all became background noise. For the first time in years, Victor felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time. Regret. Aisha. He whispered her name, as if saying it out loud would confirm the truth. She took a step closer, her eyes never leaving his. "You left my mother," she said, her voice steady. "You left me. You walked away, built your empire, and never once wondered what happened to the child you abandoned." Victor opened his mouth, but no words came out. What could he possibly say? Aisha shook her head. "Do you know what it was like growing up without a father? Watching my mother work herself to the bone just to keep food on the table. Do you know what it feels like to wonder why you weren't good enough to be loved?" Victor exhaled, running a hand over his face. He had spent his entire life chasing power, money, status. He had convinced himself that leaving Aisha's mother had been necessary, that he had done what was best for himself. He had told himself that cutting ties had been the cleanest solution. But standing here now, looking into the eyes of the daughter he had abandoned, all of those justifications felt meaningless. I didn't know," he finally said, his voice quieter than before. "I didn't know about you." Aisha let out a dry laugh. "That's the excuse you're going with." She shook her head. "You didn't know. Or you just didn't care enough to find out." Victor's throat tightened. He had spent years making ruthless decisions in business, calculating every octave move with precision, but no deal, no negotiation had ever made him feel this unprepared, this vulnerable. "I was young," he admitted. "I was selfish, and I thought I was making the right choice." Aisha's jaw clenched. "The right choice for who?" "Certainly not for me. Not for my mother, who gave up everything to raise me alone, while you built your empire." He had no answer, because there was none. Silence stretched between them, heavy and unspoken. Then, Victor did something no one in the room expected. He took a breath, then said, "I was wrong." Aisha's eyes flickered with surprise. She had spent years imagining what she would say if she ever came face to face with the man who left her behind. She had imagined screaming, crying, making him feel the pain she carried. But what she hadn't expected was this: seeing regret in his eyes, seeing the weight of guilt settle onto his shoulders. "I don't expect forgiveness," Victor continued, "and I know I can't erase what I did, but I do care." He hesitated, then said, "And if you'll let me, I want to try to make it right." Aisha studied him, searching for any sign of manipulation. But for the first time, he looked human, not the untouchable billionaire, not the ruthless businessman, but a man who had made mistakes. She took a deep breath. "You can't change the past," she said. "But I'm not the same little girl you walked away from. And I won't make it easy for you." Victor nodded. "I wouldn't expect you to." The tension between them didn't disappear, but something shifted. The past couldn't be undone, but maybe, just maybe, the future could be rewritten. Aisha turned to leave, but before she walked away, she paused. "If you're serious about making things right," she said over her shoulder, "then prove it." Victor watched as she disappeared into the crowd, her words lingering in his mind. He had spent his life believing that success was measured in power and wealth. But standing there, he realized the one thing he had spent years ignoring was the one thing he couldn't buy: family. And for the first time in decades, Victor Langston wasn't thinking about profits, investments, or status. He was thinking about a daughter he never knew he had, one he wasn't ready to lose again.